glad you're all here. I am Holly Wilson. I'm the pastor of Care and Community here at University, and I'm glad that you have chosen to come and spend your time with us this evening. I want to start by just recognizing our mental health initiative team. Raise your hands here at this table, those of you that have been helpful in this. And Steve Welch in the back. Steve is on staff now as our church counselor. Kelly, there's Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. What we've done, what you're going to hear about tonight is really the work of all these people, prayerful work, looking at the mental health survey that we did a year ago, that brought to light some issues that were going on in our congregation that we thought were important enough for us to take some time to talk about. So we're going to spend tonight talking about child abuse. Before we get into that topic, I want to let you know there's information in the back. There's all kinds of brochures about mental health, and there's a very handy brochure that are resources of therapists, psychiatrists, counseling centers, other resources that this team put together to put in your hands if you're looking for some help out there and you needed some resources. That's there. A couple other announcements. If you were here last week, on the back table is a copy of the bowl story that Pat read. Some of you were asking for that. It's on the back table. There's also copies of the slides from last week. Some of you were asking for copies of the slides. They're in the back as well, so if you want to pick that up, some of the research that we talked about, you might want to see. And there, as of right now, the topic night, or the conversation that we started last week is now on our website. So if you weren't here and you want to see that, or if you have people that you wish were here, that you want to see that, you can go onto the university website on the Care and Community page, and you can access the video from our session last week. And if you can't find it, call me. I'll talk you through it. It's a little bit, you kind of have to be savvy to find it, but most of you are. So if you can't find it, call and we'll help you find that. I'm gonna get Kevin Pernicano is going to start us tonight on kind of the clinical perspectives of child abuse. And before I call Kevin up, I want to say a couple of things. This topic is a hard one. And some of you are in this room because it is your life experience. Some of you are in this room because you love someone and it was their life experience that they had sexual, physical, or emotional abuse as a child. Some of you are here because you're loving church members and you want to know about this conversation so that you can help others that you might come across in our congregation and in our community. Regardless, this is a very tender topic. And there are people in this room that are going to be kind of raw about some of the things we talk about. It's okay tonight if you want to cry. It's okay tonight if you don't want to cry. I want you to know that there are people right now down the hall. Our prayer ministry team is praying for all of us in this room during this time. That there would be some healing, that the words that we would speak truth and wholeness, if there's brokenness. And at the end of this evening, if you would like someone to pray with you, I will tell you where they are, and they are eager to pray with anybody that just wants prayer. Just walk in and say, I want you to pray for me. They're there to pray for you. Because this topic is so tender and so important, I want to start out by saying something that we trivialize sometimes, but I believe every word of it. And it's a way that the Episcopal Church prays. If you've ever been to the Episcopal Church, do you know what they do before they pray? They say, the Lord be with you. And the congregation says, and also with you. So, would you just take a minute and let that be true right now? I'm going to say it again. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Father, fill this space with healing and hope and truth. Fill this place and fill these people with the promise that you see us, all of us, just as we are, and that you love us anyway, and that in your love, whatever has been broken can be redeemed. So use this time, Lord, to redeem, to heal, to teach, and to open us to the hope we can have in you. It's in Christ that we pray. Amen. Amen. We're talking about this topic tonight because it affects God's people. And where God's people are broken, where God's people have had hurt, God is present and God cares. And so that's why the church is talking about this. The other reason the church is talking about this is because in the mental health survey that we did last fall, this was one of the top 5 issues that people in our congregation are dealing with. Think about that. There's a lot of people in this congregation that have been touched by abuse. So Kevin, Dr. Kevin Pernicano is going to give us sort of a clinical introduction to the topic of abuse, and then we're going to have someone speak as a survivor of abuse. And so let's get started. We'll also have a time of question and answer at the end. So if you've got a question, hold on to it. There'll be a time for you to ask at the end. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Holly. And thank you for bringing the introduction to this, the seriousness of the problem of child abuse. It is a serious issue that affects people in all walks of life. The impact of child abuse, it's the foundation of our future generations. And so when there's abuse, it widely affects the children who then become adults as we are. And there's so many costs to society, to work, family, spouses, partners, you name it. So this is a very serious topic and has a certain, what we call gravitas to it. So. By the way, let me also thank my wife, Dr. Pat Pernicano, who is also a fellow psychologist, for helping put these PowerPoints together. She's very good at doing that. So I want to give her some credit. So, try to define what child abuse is. If you have experienced it, or you know someone who has experienced it, or you read about it in the media, physical, verbal or emotional, or sexual. Okay? And these are kind of defined here. But basically it's an attempt to hurt someone else, usually a child, someone who has less power than you. I get this question all the time. Do you believe in corporal punishment? Is spanking abuse? Well, oops, I'm sorry, wrong way. Physical punishment, often called discipline. Is it discipline? It always involves a power differential and stresses obedience. Now, as psychologists, we look at what's the research that bases our opinions and our beliefs. And really that there are no positive benefits from physical punishment relative to other forms of discipline that we can use that are far more effective for our children, and there are many negative outcomes to spanking. Perpetrators of abuse. They can be what's called intrafamilial, or within your own family. Could be extended family. Sometimes the abuse might be intended or accidental. Sometimes it might be based on cross-generational or cultural beliefs and practices, but they still constitute the practice of abuse. It's often extrafamilial as well. How many times in the media today do we hear about a religious clergy person, a priest or a pastor, or a youth leader, or a teacher, or a coach who perpetrates some kind of abuse on their charges? It usually involves something called coercion or grooming. Not the grooming that we do every morning when we get up to comb women. I used to have hair, and the rest of us that have. But it seems like sometimes people that have been affected by abuse, somehow perpetrators pick them out of a crowd. And they groom them, and they bring them in, and they try to love them, and they try to befriend them, and then they advance to abuse. What happens in abusive and neglectful homes? Adults may be unreliable, arbitrary, hurtful, neglectful. Often the adults will put their needs before the child's. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a parent that says, well, my needs are so important, I've got to have my needs met. It doesn't matter what my children want, whether that's substance abuse, or financial, or emotional. Sometimes adults will reweave or rework the history so that it seems like maybe abuse is okay. The adults have poor boundaries. Where does the adult stop and the child begin? What I mean by that is sometimes the adults behave more like the children. And the adults foster insecurity and mistrust in their children. Child abuse can affect children in a lot of ways. We've identified that it can result in slow brain development, can impair memory, can result in verbal delays, and all these other things. And this isn't just because necessarily there's a physical injury. This is the result of emotional hurt, psychological hurt that comes from the abuse. How abuse affects you. Dr. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist. He's an expert in the evaluation and treatment of childhood trauma. And one of the things that he states is, abuse leaves the child's brain in a state of fear. Now, how many of you believe that fear is good for you? Good, because fear, well, anxiety may be okay if it's moderate, because it motivates you. And if fear, we're talking about fear that is dread. Dread leaves the child's brain in a state of fear. And the age of abuse or severe neglect makes a difference. The earlier it happens, the more it impacts the functioning. Mostly because children that are very young don't have the brain capacity to make sense of something that even they know isn't right. The longer it goes on, the greater the impact of the abuse. And when someone you love hurts you, it affects trust and what we call attachment. And so you learn not to trust the people that are really supposed to take care of you. And that can have lifelong effects. Abuse results in insecure attachment, parent-child relationships. As I said earlier, that's the foundation of our future generations. And these parent-child relationships are the building blocks, and those blocks are crumbled. The parent's own attachment affects how he or she relates to children and their grown-up partners. And an insecure attachment, or one that's uncertain, affects the view of the child, others, and the world. So, what are some kinds of insecure attachments? An anxious child might be clingy, dependent, might tolerate inappropriate partner behavior when they become adults. An avoidant person, as they grow up, might meet their own needs, but not turn to others because they can't trust. They've been hurt too badly. Ambivalent, push-pull in relationships. I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. Oh, I want to be with you, oh, I don't want to be with you. Very confusing for partners. Or disorganized insecure attachment. Moods aren't regulated. Sometimes folks become suicidal, and they become self-harming. As I said earlier, child abuse may result in lifelong problems or symptoms. Sometimes you might re-experience the abuse if you have experienced abuse, where you'll have dreams or images, intrusive memories, or discomfort around other people that resemble or act like the abuser. These are symptoms of PTSD as well, post-traumatic stress disorder, which sometimes people who are victims or experience abuse will develop. I can't tell you that there was one time I remember that I was treating a female. She went into the mall and I came to the session next time and said, oh my gosh, I walked into the store and there was a guy that looked just like my, and it wasn't the perpetrator. But just because they resembled, acted like the abuser, she became anxious and experienced anxiety and fear. Some other lifelong problems, again, persistent avoidance. These are all numbing, restricted range of motion. These are all symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And often people that have experienced childhood abuse, if it goes on long enough, develop any of these symptoms. Further symptoms, you can read through these. Other trauma-related problems that come, not necessarily just post-traumatic stress disorder or stress-related problems, but depression, anxiety and worry, mood regulation, sleep problems, executive functioning deficits. That doesn't mean like, presidential behavior. This is like, not corporate behavior, but you can't make good decisions. Your brain doesn't function well. Learning disabilities, somatic concerns, aches and pains. Still more. And the list goes on and on. The long-term effects of trauma. This is how it affects your behavior in day-to-day life. Poor school performance, poor coping resources. External locus of control means you feel like everything controls you and you have no say over what happens to you. Usually there's a balance, but people that have experienced abuse feel like the world controls them. Emotional health problems, chronic states of stress, autoimmune disorders, fibromyalgia, lupus, other things like this can occur. How does one get over child abuse? I don't know if we ever really get over it. I think we can receive adequate treatment for it. But the idea is to help the individual build trust and attachment to create a secure base. Often that can happen in a therapeutic relationship with a stable, consistent therapist, or group support, or spiritual support. Empower and build self-efficacy, knowing you can control things in your own life, learning to take control of your life. Changing your internal beliefs about who you are, others, and the world around you can help bring the person who's experienced abuse more into a stable life. Clarify adult responsibility for the abuse and neglect. It is never the child's fault that they experience abuse, because they're children. The adult is fault.
The thing, you keep saying child abuse.
Yes.
What about in situations where they're older than a child, like 16 and up or so, but there is still abuse? You said that earlier it's more impactful the younger it is, but are these things still, even when fully grown in a parent-child relationship?
Absolutely,
like
absolutely. The issue is when children don't have the cognitive capacity to even make sense of the horrible things that can happen with abuse. As adults, we have a little more foundation, and we have the ability to abstract a little more, but absolutely, you can experience abuse at any point in your life. I was focusing more on the impact of child abuse, but certainly there are horrible events. I think we'll be doing some of this next week.
Trauma is next week.
We'll talk about trauma next week. But you can list a litany of any of the traumatic events that occur to adults, and absolutely have an effect. Absolutely, many of these things can arise. The issue that I'm striking at is that a child, again, doesn't have the cognitive development to even make sense of these things, and the hurts often occur at a level that the child can't even be able to verbalize what they have experienced. Whereas as an adult, you might be able to speak to it because your verbal skills are a little more sophisticated. But absolutely, yes, it has consequences as an adult as well. One of the things to look at is the concept of forgiveness. And I tread lightly here because sometimes you'll hear popular concepts, oh, just forgive them, everything will be fine. Well, forgiveness is choosing to let go of the burden of past abuse. You choose your boundaries of who you have to be, want to be around. Doesn't mean that you have to go back to the person that abused you. It doesn't mean that you have to be around people that hurt you. You make that choice. You get to decide to turn the judgment of the perpetrator to God. And it's not forgetting, and it's not condoning. People think if you forgive, you're going to forget. Never forget. Never condone it, which means you never say it was okay that that happened. It's not okay. And forgiveness is more for the forgiver than the forgiven. Because many times the perpetrator isn't even alive anymore. They don't know or care. You're the one that carries the burden of the hurt. So being able to forgive allows you to turn the judgment over to God. Cross-generational abuse. Abuse occurs in families due to avoidance, secrecy, and it tends to cross generations. A lot of research supports the idea that if someone has been a victim of abuse, or is I use that term very, it's a bad term, because just a person's experienced abuse. A person's experienced abuse may be more likely to continue the abuse on in their family. If they receive treatment, the chances are less that will happen. People who have experienced previously child abuse, they may have blinders on about who they can or can't or should not trust. You can think a very young child, very confusing about who their caretakers are. The person has protective responsibility for children in the family who may be at risk. And that's the person who is in charge of their family, who has young children. They are the protectors of their own children, their family members. There's some website resources. I think there's a handout, so these will be on there, and you can look them up on the internet. There are other additional resources, different projects. These are, I would call them, they're professional resources, but they're very approachable. So you're not going to have a lot of numbers and statistics, but they'll talk about the background, the traumatic, the treatment for trauma. Again, further resources. Now, one of the things that we didn't have a slide on, though I'll just address briefly, treatment for child abuse. A couple things. It depends on when the intervention takes place, when the child is to be treated. It also is determined by the severity and the duration of the abuse that the child experienced. And those will all determine the type of treatment and the varieties of treatments that might be used. Some of the things that will often be used: family therapy, individual cognitive or interpersonal therapy, play therapy, trauma narrative therapy, or psychopharmacology, medication as needed to bring the person back into better contact with reality. The most important thing in dealing with trauma treatment for children is to address the elements that arise in the person who's experienced the abuse. And that will determine where the therapy goes. And many times it will shift or change. You might start dealing with anxiety or trust, and then it'll morph into something else where you'll have substance abuse or more serious mental disorders. And so it becomes a very complex treatment for a very complex problem. Thank you very much.
There'll be time for questions at the end. We'll do question and answer at the end. So if you've got something on a note card or you've got a note card in front of you, write your question, hold on to it, and we'll have time for that toward the end. Thank you, David, if you'll turn on the lights. Appreciate that. Or not. So one of the things, you just got some clinical information about child abuse. And so that's not the only thing we need to do here. If we were taking a college course on the psychology of abuse, we'd be done now. But we're not. We're a church. We're a church. And so we've got to take the information that we know from the clinicians and the psychological community and pair that with our faith. And our faith is a faith of hope. And I'll tell you that in my ministry, I've never seen anything be more impactful to bring hope to people than putting in front of someone that has experienced some event, putting in front of them someone that is alive and well and has lived through that event. It's incarnational hope. It's hope with flesh on. It's Jesus with flesh on. And so each time we meet over the next today and the next 4 weeks, there will be somebody that's going to tell a story of how they have lived with or through whatever our topic is. I've spent time praying about who that person needs to be. I've sat down with the people that are going to share to make sure that, number one, we weren't doing any harm to them, and that they were feeling like their story could be used for good, and that their story could connect people to God. Those are the 3 rules of the United Methodist Church, by the way. Wesley's 3 rules are do no harm, do good, and stay connected to God. So, I'm a Methodist, I like that. And so tonight, Mitzi Cutterdahl, am I saying your last name right?
Yes.
Close enough. Mitzi is going to come and share her story. So I ask right now that you would join me in prayer for Mitzi. Lord, use Mitzi's story, use her life to point others to hope. Give Mitzi strength in this moment to tell her truth as best she can, and give us ears to hear it in a way that can bring healing and hope. It's in Christ that we pray. Amen. So welcome Mitzi, would you?
Thank you. That explains everything. When I was 18 months old, I fell in the corner of a coffee table, and I lost my vision in my left eye. And so I always felt odd. I always felt I didn't quite fit in. And I had 2 other brothers, they were born exactly 4 years apart. They were thick as thieves. So I was the lonely one. I was the one that was the baby. So I would get the cute little names like, oh, you're klutz, you're stupid, you're ugly. Just very hurtful words, not in a playful way, but in an ugly way. So I believed them. I believed every word of that. And plus I didn't have friends, so that was like, that's proof. It must be so. And it was many years later, I was wondering, gosh, you know, I was in bed, and when I was about 2 or 3, I was wondering, why did I always hate to fall asleep? I hated to fall asleep because I thought somebody came to get me. And so there was, I want to say about 10, 15 years later, I found out my aunt would come and visit me. And my mom would say she would come in and rock you. But I always felt that the boogeyman came to get me. Have no memory of that, but I felt this was not a good thing. It wasn't a loving and kiss me and rub and put me down. I was fearful. So I wasn't a very good sleeper, so it's very interesting to see how sleep deprivation and such can happen. Later on, my parents did divorce, and that's why my aunt was kind of living with us. And so again, I always felt that I was left out, that there was this big secret going on, but I wasn't a part of that secret. Since my mother divorced, and it was an ugly divorce, she didn't want, my mother did not want me to be around my father. It was just a bad thing, so she found the next man to move us. So my dad did not know where we were, and he was incredibly abusive. They weren't together very long, but it was just horrible. So she left, and we lived in this little trailer, and I was, about this time, I was about 8, 9 years old. And my mom had to work 2 jobs because, you know, she had to pay the bills. So there would be nights that I would be woken up, but I wouldn't open my eyes. I had my eyes closed. while the abuse was happening. And it was probably went on for about a year. And my mom found another gentleman, and they got married, and so things got better. And I didn't remember. All I remembered was I was being woken up, and all I could think about is just hurry up. I just want to get this over with. And so when we were moving to my stepdad, we got 2 dogs, Easy and Chi-Chi. Chi-Chi was a little Chihuahua, lived in Florida, and Chi-Chi Rodriguez was a big golfer there. So Chi-Chi just fell in love with me, and he was my dog. And so Chi-Chi came and slept on my bed. Chi-Chi slept on my pillow. And anyone that would walk in or by the door or just creak the door open, she would just, she would not want anyone near me. So that's when the sexual abuse stopped. And so later on, my stepdad was an alcoholic. So there was some chaos, not as much as it was before. So I married an alcoholic, not David.
Thank you for adding that.
So it was, his father came from a lot of abuse. He was military, and he had experienced a lot of seeing his mom getting beat up a lot. He was not abusive in the beginning, but the alcohol and the drugs kicked in, and he just became more verbal, abusive. And so at this time I was pregnant with my daughter, and I'm going, what am I doing? What am I teaching her that experiencing blackouts and kind of disconnected with us? And what am I doing? So God is funny. When I was pregnant with my daughter, there was an associate pastor that was there as well. And he invited me to church. And the only thing that I knew about church was the 10 Commandments. So I had a lot to learn. So anyway, I went to church, my daughter went to church, and I wanted her to grow up and have a more functioning family than I did. And through prayer, and one night when my ex-husband took a hand, he was going to hit me, and I said, thank you, Lord, for showing me what I need to do. I need to leave. And that was when I was starting a Bible study, and it was like 2 days later after I made that decision to leave. I went to this Bible study. It was a Bethmore Bible study. And it was helping me be in the Word every day, and helping me go through and staying with a friend of mine. And so I was growing. And then at that time I said, okay, Lord, change me. And when you ask the Lord to change you, He does. And He took me to my foundation, and He said, all right. I went into counseling for several years, going, okay, why did I marry an alcoholic? And I think I need to discuss this sexual abuse thing. And because it would pop up every now and then, and the sleep problem continued after I had my daughter, and it actually became worse. So, sorry, I'm getting more. So through counseling and learning about the Lord and praying, okay, Lord, I cannot remember this. I don't know if I can let this go, if I don't know exactly what happened. And so numerous years I've prayed that prayer. And then one day I was watching a video, and it was Moses, and Moses wanted to see God. And Moses was put in a cleft. And God said, I'm going to walk past, and I'm going to put my hand so you cannot see me. And so he walks past, and at that moment, God was speaking to me. He said, you don't have to know exactly what happened to you. I was protecting you. So it was like, wow, what a God we have, that he can take my brokenness and build me up and take that. It's like, it's okay, I don't have to know to get to the other side. But it took numerous years, and that prayer was not answered right away. And so as I continue to work and grow in my faith, and but I couldn't have done it without God, because it was just, I felt very broken. And that's how I felt. I was just, my family taught me that I wasn't worthy. But God said, no, you're precious, and I'm going to take what you have. And became a massage therapist at one point. And so God's kind of humor going, whatever, you know, the hands that hurt, I'm going to give you hands that heal. So that is our God, and thank you very much.
Sacred gift of your story and the courage to share that. I know people were blessed by your sharing. A couple of things I want to pick up out of the story, just maybe to help you hang on to. I'll start at the end. Hands that, Mitzi's story was a story of hands that were used to hurt. And as she became a massage therapist, they were hands that were used to heal. That's how God works in all of our lives. It can take the story of brokenness and pain, whatever that is, whether that's a story of abuse in your life or anxiety or mental, whatever it is, grief, whatever it is, God can take where the brokenness is and rewrite that story in a way that where there's been pain, there can be actually power. Here we are again at the cross. We talked about this a little bit last week. The cross is a place, a symbol that for us we take great pride in. But the cross was a symbol of pain. Think about when Jesus was walking to the cross. This was not, oh yay, crosses are good. This is, hey, this is where pain, this is the most painful thing that can happen. But how God has used an instrument of pain, redeemed it, and it's a place of power for us. There's so much in just witnessing someone telling the story of painfulness. It, by the way, doesn't define her. It's part of her story, not one that she's not ever going to tell. It's clearly part of Mitzi's story. But it's part of her story that she is embodying in a way that she's found power in it. So that's, I guess, the spiritual theological teaching I'd like to lift up again tonight. We are conditioned in our society that where there is hurt, we need to find relief or avoid it, right? Run away, get away from it as fast as you can. And yet our faith is quite the opposite. It says God loves you enough that you can go to the places where there is pain and find power and redemption. So when Mitzi stood up, how many of you saw a victim?
No.
How many of you saw a survivor? How many of you saw a thriver? That's the promise we have in Jesus Christ. It's not magic. It takes hard work. There was counseling. It was part of her hard work. This isn't just pray it away stuff. This is believing in a God that says we can lean into where the hurt is. And God loves us enough to not leave us where that hurt is, but to help us rewrite the story in such a way that where there was hurt, there can now be healing and hope and power. better? What's better than that? So Christians are really good at talking about Easter and celebrating the empty tomb with Easter lilies and all the butterflies and all that stuff, and that's wonderful. But Easter loses its power if we can't embrace the Good Fridays of our life. It takes the work of clinicians and doctors to do that sometimes, and it also takes our faith. So hopefully the conversation tonight has been one that has encouraged you if you've got painful stories that you haven't told or that you are not sure what to do with. I hope that tonight's talk has given you courage to at least come up at the end and talk to one of us. I hope tonight's story, if you love someone whose story is abuse, that you can remember the power that Mitzi had tonight. You don't have to be just what happened to you. If you love someone that's been abused, that doesn't have to define them. They can thrive. And so I think I need to shut up now and give a little bit of time for question and answer in the large group or comments. Anyone have any questions or comments that you want to pitch to the group here? Here and then over here.
I'm curious, you often hear abuse and neglect go together. Are the symptoms of neglect the same as abuse, pretty much?
So she's asking, do abuse and neglect go together? Are they the same symptoms? I'll leave that to our team of clinicians here.
Severe neglect often occurs at very young ages, and so severe neglect often results in children first protesting, like trying to get somebody to feed them, to take care of them. And then, if they're young enough, they just shut down. And so infants who are neglected tend to dissociate, who now become silent. The crib babies we heard about from the Ukraine, they shut down. At a little older ages, though, children start acting like little adults. You'll hear stories of, I knew a 6-year-old who, he said, I'm a good big brother. He was giving the bottle to the baby in the morning and helping his siblings get off to school because mom left and went to work. So that kind of neglect isn't good for kids to grow up taking care of themselves. So then as adults, sometimes you think you can't ask for help. You don't need anyone. You always took care of yourself because nobody else could be trusted. So there's less, well, there's not less fear. There's fear because you're all alone and you're left in the dark and you're left without food. So there's many of the same symptoms. There's a lot of overlap.
Great question. Mundo, you had a question?
Yeah, I had 3. You want to hear them all, or you want to say one?
Well, let's start. Let's start.
Yeah. So this was one that was prompted by your slide. So what exactly is the perpetrator looking on let's say it's an external one, and they focus in 1,000 people there, they focus in on that one. What are they looking for? Because I've got children and hopefully.
It's a great question. Let me make sure everybody heard it. So he's asking, when Kevin was talking about familial perpetrators, that they kind of groom, they'll look for somebody to groom to abuse, and it's a great question, Mundo. He's wanting to know, what are they looking for? He wants to protect his kids. What are they looking for?
What makes a victim?
What makes a victim?
One of the things that at least I've observed is that often there's it's a child, it's someone that has sort of a fundamental need or you can call it a weakness, but just something where they clearly are lacking something. Perhaps they were neglected, perhaps they were abused, but they seem hurt in some way. And there's something about a perpetrator that just sort of figures that out. A good example, I had a patient who was from a different country, and he had a very abusive family. His father and origin had beaten him every day until he left. His mother remarried or lived with a man who then sexually abused the boy. When the boy reached the age of 16, his stepfather at that time kicked him out, had no job, nowhere to go, so he went to the local church. And the priest welcomed him in with open arms, and it continued on.
Oh.
Now, if that child had been someone that maybe hadn't had such a traumatic past, and maybe came to, for example, the Catholic Church at that time in another country, maybe the priest would say, oh, you know, you're a boy, we're going to put you over in the boys' school, and we'll deal with that. But in this case, this person, the perpetrator, recognized the need in that child, recognized the weakness, and took advantage of it. So that may be some of, I don't know that there's necessarily a profile other than a child who has needs that they aren't able to assert their own, like, don't touch me, leave me alone, that's wrong. And they just don't respond in a way that shuts the perpetrator down. And the perpetrators groom them by buying them treats, buying them candy, getting a pet for them, taking them places.
They look for a child who's vulnerable, who might like feeling special, who might be lonely, who might not have parent figures that are paying attention to them. So they're looking for a child who would respond to all of that kindness and not know the difference. So they probably haven't been taught.
Vulnerable is a great word. They are vulnerable in some way, and the perpetrator knows how to get inside that vulnerability.
Second question. We're talking about child abuse, but if you weren't the one physically being abused, but you witnessed it over and over again, is that still considered child abuse?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Great question.
Yes, a witness of abusive behavior is as much if you will, victim of abuse as the person receiving the abuse. You see this in families all the time, where maybe there's you can call it a preferred victim, where a parent might physically beat up one child or other child, and the other child watches but is never touched. But they're just as victimized because they live in fear, and they live in dread that maybe they'll be next. And also an empathy for their sibling.
And also, what if it was a parent?
Yes,
Or a parent.
domestic
Yes.
Watching a
violence.
parent, yeah. Which means he's got part of your story. Yeah.
Well, you know, we work with parents who say, well, when we fight, our kids are asleep. No. What they don't know is the kids wake up, hear the fight, sometimes hide in the closet, hide downstairs. They know what's going on, and there's symptoms of post-traumatic stress in those children.
Last question. I have more, but it's on the road. But so you had a big list of victims. You had a list of things to watch out for, and a lot of those lists, they seem like nowadays they classify them as I'll just use a generic term, ADHD. How do you know when it's somebody who just going through that symptom versus somebody who's been neglected and he just hasn't been diagnosed correctly?
We have a lot of tests that we use that look at behaviors and the background to try to discern if there's a differential or different diagnosis between ADHD, which is a very specific set of symptoms, and PTSD. It's possible that a child who might have attentional issues may also have been traumatized. But there are a lot of children who are ADHD, probably overdiagnosed nowadays, but many who have what they call ADD or ADHD that have not been traumatized, even though they may be difficult children at times.
Because I saw that listed like a fight to a whole bunch of things.
You know, symptoms of anxiety can look like ADHD. Trauma can look like ADHD. The best, maybe the nutshell is ADHD kids are oblivious and they're not very anxious and they're not very fearful. They're more impulsive, you know. They're ADHD and they have all those symptoms. But traumatized kids who are hyperactive or can't pay attention, they have a fearfulness about them or an anxiety. Like they're running around the room but they're watching. And they're looking for signs that something bad might happen. ADHD kids are oblivious to that.
And sleep problems are much more common in
Yes.
traumatized kids.
Yes.
And we take history too, so there's tests and there's, other things, but we're always taking history. So if we're talking to children, we're also talking to their parents. So we'll find out oftentimes if there's history of abuse or other things that we ought to be considering and say, well, maybe it's not ADHD, it's something else.
We have a lot of parents bring kids to us who say, I think my child has ADHD, the school teacher sent them. And then I'll get a history, and one little girl I worked with for a long time, turned out at 9 months of age, she'd been hit in her mom's arms during a fight. She'd been locked in a bathroom at about 12 months of age. She had this long history of traumatic events. And I said, well, she could be ADHD and have trauma. It does, you know, it's possible. But certainly we try and look for things that are a pattern.
Yeah.
Back here, let's go back here first.
I just want to see if I could add to the grooming, because I wanted to emphasize that offenders are also master manipulators. And so it's not always that there is, I mean, vulnerable, yes, because every child is vulnerable, but it's not always that there's some abuse that has already happened. They can manipulate, like, I'm a pastor and I'm your grandpa, so anything that I do to you is obviously supposed to be okay. And so they can manipulate even when kids are very strong kids. So I want to emphasize that just because education is so important on that for kids. Because if they know, and if they know that it's okay early on, no matter who it is that does this, no matter what they tell you, come tell me because it's not okay. Or talk about it. I just wanted to...
Thanks, Lydia. Lydia is also a clinician. I'm going to pick up on that for just a second and just say one of the things that's going to be happening in the spring, because of this topic being so prevalent, and a lot of the questions tonight are coming up about, so what do we do for our kids? I mean, I'm hearing that undertone and everything that we're saying. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but we are going to be doing some things around how do you talk to your kids about sex, and how do you talk to your kids about being safe in a positive way. So know that's coming as some of the programming that's going to come out in the spring. But these are, if we're going to talk about and be honest about histories of abuse that's going on in our adults, then we've got to equip our adults on how to talk to our children so that the cycle doesn't just keep going and keep going and keep going. Okay, we had somebody back here and then somebody over here. Yeah.
I wanted to say I came out of a lot of those spiritual abuse. Excuse me, and there seems to be a lot of confusion between the difference between forgiveness and trust. And it was almost like if you forgave them, then you would trust them again.
Yeah, that's not what we're saying.
No, I know it's not what you're saying, but to me that's one of those problems that keeps children, especially, in that abusive situation because they feel like if I've forgiven them, then I need to, and it's too completely.
And you know, forgiveness, you don't have to spend time with them. You don't have to ever see them again.
Right.
You don't have to talk to them.
Right.
You're not under any obligation. So you have freedom to
Right.
choose.
But they think this amount that they trust is the proof that they forgave them.
Right.
Yeah. And the perpetrator will
And
try to sell that.
Right.
Like, well,
I've seen that.
I apologize to you. Now we should have Easter
Right.
together.
Right.
No.
Forgiveness is so much more about the forgiver
Yes,
than it is about the forgiven.
it's your burden.
And yet my clergy brothers and sisters in lots of ways get that wrong and try to force people into this place of forgiving when that's not what needs to be happening. This forgiveness is for you, so that you don't bear the burden, but there's a lot of work that goes into that. So it's not, ooh, okay, everything's all right. All right, one more question here, and then we're gonna shift. Yeah, somebody else? Yeah, Jeanette, and then you've asked for to come back. Yeah, Jeanette. Carol, sorry. You're sitting together and it's been a long day. Okay. Yeah, Carol.
I was told years ago that forgiving is giving them up. And I love that.
Forgiving is giving them. Yeah, okay. All right, we've got time for one more.
My question is, I'm raising grandchildren, and I know most of their childhood, but I don't know all of it. And what I see is a lot of attention-seeking behavior and making things up, going to the nurse, 3 and 4 times a week for attention. Is that related to trauma?
Yeah, it is.
Attention-seeking behaviors is related to trauma.
They're seeking security. They're making sure that they have, if they need something, that it's provided quickly and reliably because they never got that. And so now they need it. And they're checking kind of, are adults to be trusted? Can I get my needs met? Do these people mean what they say? It's a kind of anxiety-based symptom.
But
It will get better.
Margie, you want to add into it?
if that, though she doesn't know the history, it doesn't necessarily mean it's abuse. It could be just.
It's just an insecurity or attention-seeking. Yeah, you can't know the source.
Transition can cause that.
It could be not even necessarily that they're attention seeking, but are they avoiding something else? Are they going to the nurse to escape something that's in the classroom? That they're now
Yeah.
going to
Yes.
something instead of from something?
And what about lying and making things up?
Maybe age appropriate.
Most kids do that.
Yeah.
With regard to going to the nurse, a child could be harassed at school. And they go to the nurse to try to get to go home to escape the classroom that perpetrator's in. So,
Peers can be perpetrators.
yes, absolutely.
I remember our daughter in, what was she, 1st or 2nd grade? And this little girl, it turned out, was cornering her in the bathroom at school to grope her. And she stopped going to the bathroom at school because she was afraid. And we finally got, this little 8-year-old girl was, you know, was abusing other little kids at school.
I want to talk about one more thing before we break, and if you have other questions, or if you have a question that you didn't want to ask publicly, the team is going to be up here, and you're welcome to come forward and talk to us one-on-one at the end. One of the things that came out that I wanted to speak specifically about today is triggers, because just this conversation can be a trigger to some of you if you've lived through abuse. And do you mind talking about the cat litter box?
Go for it.
Sure. It's okay? Yeah. So Mitzi shared with me that she, as she was getting ready to talk about this, she shared with me that her stepdaughter, her daughter, is living with them and has a cat, and the cat litter box is in
Our master bedroom.
the cat litter box is in the bedroom, and the smell of the urine in the cat litter box was a trigger for her. That there were some memories that were coming back from that. I guess I don't have anything super, I probably should let you guys talk about this, but if tonight has triggered something for you, or if in tomorrow or the next day, just this conversation has triggered something for you, come talk to me. Let me connect you to Steve or to some of our other clinicians that are here tonight. Come back next week and let's talk about it. I think if you have a trigger and you're not paying attention to it, it can cause more damage. So what we want to do is invite you, if just this conversation begins stirring things up for you, don't shut it down. Know that this is a safe place and there are safe people for you to talk about that with. Did I capture that accurately?
That's good. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So lots of information. Lots of information to help other people with, to point them in the right directions. Lots of information about what the power of God can do. To rewrite our stories, not by erasing things. Not by erasing things, but by speaking redemption and hope into what has happened in a way that people can thrive. So if nothing else tonight, I hope you'll take away the image of this beautiful, powerful woman. Not me, her. That shared the truth of her life story. and the way that she has found healing and hope, and that God is using that story tonight, right now in this room. God is using Mitzi's story for good.
Could you say something about the concept we hear that if there was a loving God, He would not have permitted this to happen to me, the defense history?
Oh, yes.
Big little time.
Yes.
No.
Yes. I think God was in Chi-Chi.
Oh, she was awesome.
The dog.
I agree.
But I can talk about this most clearly from my own experience, which is not one of abuse, but is one of pain. Most of you have heard my story that I lost several pregnancies. And the first pregnancy I lost, the doctor was telling me what was happening. And I was in shock. I probably had PTSD from that, I don't know. But, and I got really mad for a really long time. I'm glad you think so. I wasn't mad at God so much, but I began to not trust God. Because I asked that question, why if God loved me? And we felt called to have a baby. And we had gone through many challenges before we got to that moment. Why would God do this? And I was a freaking pastor. And,
Who was freaking?
and I was freaking. And about 2 years after that loss, with work with a very gifted counselor, and doing my own spiritual work too, I came to understand that God was in that room with me when that doctor told me I was losing my baby. And even though I felt abandoned, God's heart broke with my heart that day.
Jesus wept.
Jesus wept. And so, you know, my story isn't one of abuse, but that's how I understand God. That when my heart breaks, God's heart breaks too. And so if you're, I think God's heart broke when evil chose to surround Mitzi's life in the way that it did. But God's love didn't crumble in that, and God's love waited and was active, like Chi-Chi.
That's why I always have a dog.
And God's love was active, so active in that moment when you thought you had to remember everything. I don't know a bigger picture of God's grace than this idea that God told Mitzi, you don't have to remember it. So bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. Bad things happen. But just because bad things happen doesn't mean that God's love doesn't reign. Does that make sense? Did I get to what you wanted to know? Is there more that I
Did you
didn't
get to
answer?
what you want?
Do you want to talk more about evil? And why bad things happen?
Different session, because it's going to be a long time.
It is a different session, but I will say that, evil does exist. I don't think it exists as a little red devil with a pitchfork. I think it exists in the brokenness of our world and our humanity. But at the end of the day, brokenness and evil never win. If they won, then we wouldn't have Easter. Good Friday's never the last word. Never. And so our job as faithful Christians is to embrace the reality that pain and suffering happen, but that God wins. God wins. Love wins. It always does. Okay.
We're not puppets with God managing our strings.
No. No, God's much more relational and much more present and interactive. Deep theological questions, deep life issues. I think the way to maybe end this with prayer. And then our team is going to be up here. If anyone has questions or comments that you want to address one-on-one, we're here to do that. If anyone would like prayer, can you, Sarah can usher you guys to 212, 214 to show where the prayer room is if you would like prayer. All right, I'm going to invite you to grab a hand if you will. Let's pray. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, surround us, each one in this room, with the power of your grace. Take the things that we talked about tonight, Lord, that can bring healing and hope. Take those and let those take root in the hearts of your people. Help us, Lord, to walk from this room knowing that love always wins. That your grace is greater than any evil, and that through the power of your grace we can find the courage to lean into the hard places in our lives and let your love work through us to redeem them. We give you thanks, and I pray for anyone in this room right now that leaves this place with uncertainty or doubt, with discomfort or pain, that you would lead them to the people and places that can point them to hope. And that you would open our ears as a church to be a place that can hear pain and direct people to hope. This is our prayer in the powerful name of Jesus, who taught us to pray, saying, Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done,